wielded a sword before in his life. But David knew one thing. He knew the power of the living God. And he was trusting in Him absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe you have a Goliath in your life right now. Maybe you have some massive thing that looks like a mountain that's taunting you. Maybe you have something in your life that's cursing God. Something in your life that you don't think you can overcome. But in order to be an overcomer, before you can even be victorious over that thing, before you can even overcome it, you have to settle in your mind one thing. And that thing is that you will trust in Jesus and you will not run away from Him, and that running away is not ever, 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 ever going to be for you an option. That no matter what happens, that you will stand with Jesus, that you will take your ground, and that you will not give in. Because, church, in your life, the battle will come, and Goliath will rise. Sooner or later, you will have this experience, and so you must settle in your mind one thing and do it today. That no matter what happens in your life, you will not run. That you will not leave Jesus. That you will trust in Him. And you will never quit. So are you willing, like David, to take a little sling? I mean, David just had a little sling. It was 2 pieces of leather with a couple of knots in it, knotted around a little holder that held a little tiny stone. And you know what it was made for? It was made for killing little birds. Yes. David had a little sling, a little teenage boy's sling that was made for killing birds. So will you, in your weakness, in the weakness of a sling that's not meant for killing giants, allow a few stones of Jesus' provision to take the giants down in your life? Because that's what an overcomer is. An overcomer recognizes their weakness. An overcomer recognizes at points in time that they are not equipped for this. But an overcomer recognizes that with God's provision, with His few small stones, that in the power of the living God, that stone can sink into the enemy's forehead and kill him. In our weakness. In our weakness. You see, here's the point about overcomers. That's why they have this amazing promise. Overcomers are not overcome. One of the things that happens in the American church today is that when trouble enters the life, even of the believer, they turn and run. But overcomers are not overcome. Because first of all, they understand their weakness and their need, and they understand, second of all, God's great provision. And they stand and face the giants in their life, and they overcome them in the power of God, because they've decided before the battle begins that they will not flee. Settle it in your mind. Overcomers choose to stand with Jesus no matter what. And so verse 8 of our text draws this amazing contrast. Scripture will do this for you time and time again if you will bear it out, if you will pay attention to it. This next verse is amazing when compared to the promise of the overcomer who will not flee. Look at verse 8. Revelation 21 verse 8. Look. But the cowardly. The cowardly. And then it goes down through all these different things. The unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, idolaters, liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. What's he talking about? I mean, think about it. He starts out, I started reading this, I'm thinking, how does he get from cowardly, overcoming promise, and he starts out with this list of sins, this list of things that will take someone to the lake of fire. It starts out with cowardly. I mean, I get the other sins. You get the other sins. I mean, they're obvious, But cowardly? I mean, I wouldn't start with cowardly, would you? Here's the thing. Those who are cowardly fall into one of 2 categories. When you study this out, when you look at this, those who are cowardly fall into one of 2 categories. Number 1, they retreated or they quit just when they were needed the most. Cowards. Flee. Number 2, they refused to allow Jesus to transform their life. So just when Jesus finally got close enough to really transform their life, they fled. They turned and fled. Cowards turn and flee. I mean, the Roman army was a massive and powerful army, and John clearly understood it. So in the text or the context of John's day, historically, this made a lot of sense. It made a lot more sense than it does to us today. So in the Roman army in John's day, cowards were those who retreated in the heat of battle, who turned their back on the enemy and ran, turned their back on their friends, their brothers in arms and ran, were treated a number of different ways, and they were treated usually pretty brutally. If you ran in the heat of battle as a Roman soldier, you were sometimes beaten, and quite often to death, and sometimes by your own soldiers when they finally caught up to you right after the battle. Or you were fed with really awful food, the worst food they could possibly find to feed you with, just enough to barely sustain your life, and they fed you with that, and they taunted you and treated you like a coward for a long, long, long time until they finally broke you down. Sometimes death was actually a better alternative. Julius Caesar said this: "Cowards die many times before their death. Valiant never taste death but once." I mean, the Roman army under Julius Caesar was massive and powerful. The Roman army under Julius Caesar, with 50,000 men, defeated another army, the Gauls, with 250,000 men. Think about that. Why? Because a Roman soldier took a vow of loyalty and obedience to his commander. A Roman soldier would never even so much as question an order, even if it made no sense to him whatsoever, because he knew the alternatives. Roman soldiers were also highly trained, very well equipped, and amazingly well disciplined. I mean, Roman soldiers, during training, were made to put on their battle armor and run 18 miles. Have you ever run 18 miles? Have you ever run 18 miles in battle armor? I mean, most of you would die. Think about it. They did this. The Roman army was so well equipped and so well trained that they used these special boots, and they were called hobnail boots. Now, every other army on the face of the planet fought in flat-bottomed sandals or flat-bottomed boots, the smooth bottom. A Roman soldier literally had short spikes that came out of the bottoms of his boots so that he could grip the ground in any condition. His enemy would slip. He would never slip. A Roman soldier, all of his power was he knew how to hold the ground, he knew how to take the ground, and he knew how to hold the ground in such a way that all of the power of his thrust and his hack and his spear and everything, his shield and everything, was formed from the ground which he was so well grounded on. So everything that he did would not slip. He didn't lose basically any of his power. Where his enemy, especially if it was wet out, would lose his power because he was slipping on his very feet or his very foundation itself. So the Roman soldier was they were so far ahead of their time. Think about this. We didn't start to give our soldiers boots that grip until like the Vietnam War. I mean, the Roman soldiers they had their soldiers, they had hobnail boots way back then, like 1,000 years before we ever even did it. This just doesn't make any sense, but think about this. Back in the Civil War, there was a battle for the town of Petersburg, which was on its way to Richmond, Virginia. And so the Southern troops, the Confederate troops were all held up in Petersburg, and they were trying to stop the Union troops from taking Petersburg because they knew if they took Petersburg, they could take Richmond, and they knew that if they took Richmond, that would be big. Richmond is the capital. So the Confederate soldiers are all held up around Petersburg, and they're trying desperately to keep the Union soldiers out of Petersburg, and they built this big berm, this giant massive bank around Petersburg. And they would shoot from the top of the bank down into the Union soldiers, and the Union soldiers just couldn't figure out a way to get up and over this bank. So they dug a tunnel. They started in the evening. They dug a tunnel into the bank. It took them a long time. They planted a massive amount of gunpowder in this tunnel that they dug under the berm or under the bank. And then one night, when all was ready, they blew that gunpowder up. And it made this giant crater, and it blew a huge piece of the berm out. And they figured if they could just get through that and get up through that crater, that they could take Petersburg. So the Union lines began to all file into this massive crater, this massive hole, thinking that they could scramble up this hole and get into Petersburg and take Petersburg. And so hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men began to run down into this giant hole that was created by this blast. And as they started to go up the other side of the hole, they realized that the blast had caused all this scrabble, all this rock, all this loose dirt to go into the hole itself. And their boots were smooth on the bottom. They were just flat leather. And as they tried to scramble up the other side of the bank, they realized that they were sliding back down. That every time they'd try to go up, they'd slide back down. Their boots were flat, so they couldn't get up. And the Confederate soldiers realized this quite quickly. So they went to the bank of this giant crater, and they started to shoot fish in a barrel. I mean, they just shot hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Union soldiers there in that hole because they couldn't get out because they had flat bottom shoes. And Roman soldiers knew better over 1,000 years earlier. Think about it. Think about the Roman army, how powerful it was, how frightening it was. Roman soldiers carried 2 swords made for 2 different applications. They had a specially made shield that was made to bat the other army's sword out of the way so they could take their smaller shield and thrust it into his ribs, right into his heart, kill him instantly. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were highly trained, highly motivated, and if you look at